Sheba and I'll be a host for today's session. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Heitor Tesaro, CEO at Right Choice. Today, he'll introduce the concept of the dock owner, a role designed to ensure documentation remains accurate, maintained, and effective. He will explore the ownership challenges that emerge when AI makes content creation effortless and explain what it takes to build documentation that serves both human users and AI agents. If you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to drop them into the Q&A box, and we'll make sure to address them towards the end of the session. With that, I'll hand it over to Heitor. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Shiba. Hello, team. Thanks for inviting me. And I am really glad to be here. And today I will talk about how the AI made the writing part easy, but created ownership problem at the same time that almost nobody is addressing right now. So before I start, I will talk a little bit about myself. I am currently the CEO at Right Choice. I have a background in electrical engineering. However, after the pandemic, I moved into technical writing. And for the last 5 years, I have been working with developers, engineers, and CTOs from API first and also SaaS companies. And in the last year or so, I see a problem that has becoming more common, So I believe that almost everyone right here is already using AI to draft content to make sure that you are following the style guide. But if someone a few years ago told me a company didn't need a technical writer because AI could draft their docs, I will not believe it. But today it's different. Today the agents are already creating the docs, they are checking the products, they are updating the content, So the writing skill is still important, but it's not a differentiator anymore. So if the writing is not a problem anymore, what is the role of a technical writer? Now we need to focus on what is going wrong to define this, to answer this. So nowadays, the main problem that I see is that no one owns the documentation in a lot of companies. And as a result, the documentation can break in 3 different ways, And for the first one, the freshness, I would like to share an example. We worked in the past with a fintech company that grew from 30 to 120 people in just 1 year. And after this period, they had like 30 developers pushing code every day, and each code change was generating a new documentation update. And sometimes the features that were no longer available, they were available in the docs. Meanwhile, the new features were not available in the docs. And this was happening because they didn't have someone to be responsible to check this. They were creating a lot of PRs directly to the documentation repo, but no one was reviewing, no one was approving. So this created a lot of problems. The second one, the alignment, it's a little bit tricky because in this case, the documentation is technically correct, However, the agents that are updating or creating the docs, they don't have all the context about the product and also about the business to take the best decision. So I saw in the past, like these agents removing pages because the feature was not available anymore. And just a few weeks later, the feature was added back to the software again, but the agent didn't know how to handle this. So the page was created in a different place with a different approach, in a different context with a different goal, basically. And that doesn't mean that the agent was not doing the job. you know. It only means that it didn't have the context. And this scenario usually happens after rushing decisions, the result in several changes in the product and in the docs in a small time frame. And when you deliver fast, but no one is evaluating the macro, the result is that the user will face problems. They will face friction because they were used to check one documentation page and now they are checking another. The agent had one context, now the context is different, you know. So this is the second problem. And the last one is about the signal. In this case, nobody is actually checking if the system is working. I think that this is aligned with what Shiba was asking, you know, because the documentation is published, but nobody is checking what people are searching in the documentation portal. Nobody is checking the analytics. Nobody is questioning the support team or evaluating the tickets from the support, you know. So these questions are never answered. You don't use the feedback that users are providing, and this keeps going until a customer complains like loudly to your team, and from one day to the other you have like a lot of change to do to make sure that the documentation is going to reflect what your users actually need, you know. So the result of this, like why this is happening, it is happening because nobody is accountable for the outcome. Nobody is responsible to make sure that the documentation process is working, you know, because the agents, they were created to be responsible. They were not created to be the responsible ones for the accountability. They can ensure the quality sometimes, you know. The examples that I shared before, they are happening in more and more companies. It is becoming the default in a lot of companies that are not paying attention to the documentation. And with so much automation added to the documentation process, it is inevitable to face these problems because the developers are shipping faster than ever, right? The amount of material that counts as documentation is growing faster than anything can keep up. And these three failures are what happens every time when the volume goes up and nobody is responsible for keeping the pace with it to organize, right? So the companies, they can create the docs using the agents. However, if nobody owns the docs, they are going to face this problem. And that is exactly my vision, at least, for the next version of what the technical writer role is and where it starts, right? So what actually fills that gap? It's a different perspective of how to be a technical writer, you know. In the past, the technical writer job was about production, creating content. You receive the task, you produce the content, you deliver, someone review, and you go to the next thing. However, the doc owner, it's not about producing, it's about the outcome that the documentation is delivering. So basically, you need to ask yourself, is the documentation still working compared to the product itself? Is it updated? Is it in line with the product roadmap and the business goal? You need to make sure that this is true, you know, because the quality process is an ongoing task that requires you to check, validate, and interact with the content, with the user, and with the technical team. You know, you need to get the feedback, you need to get the insights, and you, the writer, is the responsible to push it. You know, The doc owner is someone that is proactive about the documentation maintenance. You are not reactive. You are proactive, to deliver and update the docs, So if you remember one sentence from this talk, I would like to be this one. A doc owner is accountable for the completeness, accuracy, and relevance of the documentation, no matter who or what wrote it. And you can notice that it doesn't say anything about who created, right? It doesn't say who writes the content. It says who is responsible for it, for the docs. So it's not just about proofreading AI text for typos or consistency. It's not waiting for a ticket before doing anything. It's about being proactive. And why I have this vision about the doc owner, and I know that the name maybe it's not the best, but it's what I think that makes it clear. I want to share with you a conversation that changed how I think about this, because I spoke with a CEO after his company decided to not renew a contract with us, with Right Choice. And I asked him about the reason why you are not renewing the contract. And the answer was clear. He was asking, why did you suggest the fix? You knew the tool, you saw the problem, but you waited for me to notice. So the problem was that our behavior was the opposite of ownership. That is why we lost the contract. So a doc owner doesn't wait to be asked. That's what we are developing inside of Right Choice. You need to bring the observation, you need to share the impact, you need to bring the solution, you know. And for sure, sometimes people will push you back, and that is fine, that is normal, because the companies has its own rules. But the observation about the improvement has to come from you first. Nobody else is going to catch it for you. So you are the responsible one, right? Okay, so now you know that you are the responsible, and you need to, and you know that you are not dealing with humans anymore. You need to deal with agents as well. And the common idea nowadays, a lot of CEOs and company owners, they have this idea that the AI makes the documentation easier. It is going to generate the content, it is going to ship it, and it is done. However, what I have seen is really different, you know, because once AI agents start reading your documentation to write code to integrate with your product, in that case, if you have one page that is confusing, it is old, it is not going to confuse just one person anymore. It is going to multiply, it's going to escalate, because a lot of agents are consuming your content. So you are going to be blocking more and more users, right? So now these three standards apply more than ever. They weight more than before, and each one's requires you to address them by one. Otherwise your documentation will face a lot of the problems really soon, or it is already facing a problem. So the first one, the documentation always needs to be accurate. If the content was corrected when shipped, it was enough in the past, because humans, they were able to check the docs, they had the opportunity to ask questions to a colleague, to you, to find a work around it. And the scenario is different nowadays, right? Because the agents, for sure, they can assume and they can guess, but when the agent uses your documentation to build something, outdated page will produce the wrong output silently, and it is going to escalate, So the standard changed from the documentation needs to be correct when we ship it to something like the documentation needs to be correct every day, all the time, and that only happens if someone is actually responsible for knowing when things change, And in practice, to ensure this, we need to make the documentation part of the product release process. So a doc update and a feature release move together instead of the docs falling behind of the process. And this is something that happens a lot with different companies. In addition to that, as I mentioned before, this keeps getting harder because the bottleneck isn't writing anymore, it is checking. You need to review, like a lot of technical writers need to review a lot of content, and the number of changes are growing faster than anything can check by hand. So the solution isn't checking and reviewing faster, it's using a more intelligent approach. You don't need to focus on the less important things, you need to check the risk changes, and for the other ones, you can automate the process. You can create tests that are going to confirm that the documentation, the new step, still work after the last PR. You can take advantage of this. You can automate part of the process, but someone needs to be the owner of this process. The second one, also due to the release frequency, documentation that was correct 1 month ago has high chances to be outdated in 1 month due to the amount of releases, So the AI assisted coding is shrinking the time between a decision and then deployment. And as a result, the gap between the product and the doc opens faster than before, So if you don't have this support and this organization, you have a serious problem. And I have seen this in different companies. A team that used to ship like a couple of releases a month is now shipping like 2 or 3 a week. And that not a guess, that is how much faster the ground is moving under the documentation. So it's becoming really hard to keep tracking of everything, And when the docs are not connected to the roadmap, this is going to fail because the documentation is not going to reflect. So to meet this standard, you need to have access to what is coming next. You need to be integrated with your team, with the developers, with the sprints. And I know that's not true for all the companies, Sometimes they work in a different world, So you just know about the release when they are live, and that creates a lot of problems, even without AI, And the last one is because we have agents today, right? So when a human hits a gap in your documentation, they can guess what you meant. They can skip to the part that really matters for them. They can make assumption to overcome a problem. However, the agents, they will not do that all the time, and a lot of times they will not guess right, so they will not try a step you left out. Every requirement in this case needs to be present on the docs. Every error has to be documented. Every example needs to actually work, because the agent will try to replicate that. And you can evaluate that by yourself in your documentation portal. You can ask yourself, can an agent finish, for example, the integration with my product using only the documentation with no human help, if that is true, it's really good, you know. However, this is harder. This test of evaluating the agent output, it is harder than a human review, because as I mentioned, the humans, they can make these small fixes, they can cover the small gaps, sometimes without noticing, you know. However, the agents, they will face this blocker. And the developer, as a consequence of this, the developer experience that used to be one thing that we used to care about, okay, a human can follow this. Now it means two things, the developer experience. A human can follow my documentation, but the agent can actually run it. So both of these assumptions need to be true to provide like a really good developer experience. And in addition to this, nowadays, what we count as documentation is getting bigger too. Because if your documentation portal is sharing instructions or skills for agents, that agents we are going to use to improve the process of integrating with your product, that is something new that you didn't have in the past, you know. And you need to apply the same standard here, you know. These new documents, they need to be current, they need to be correct, and they need to be clear for these agents, you know. So this is an additional responsibility for the technical writers to cover. So how can you actually find out where you actually are on this process, you know? We use this approach, you know. So this is something that you can build by yourself. It's not something to think a lot, it's something to apply, you know. And it is simple, you can make it more complex, but you can use any agent like Cloud Code, you know. You can provide the documentation. However, it's super important that you make sure that the agent only will have access to the documentation, nothing else. No web search, no outside knowledge. So if the docs don't say something, the agent has to say that it found a blocker and it should stop, you know. It should not make any assumption. And in this process, you need to provide like a really clear goal, not something like take a look to my documentation and tell me what you think. That is too generic. You need something really specific to have something really good out of the agent process, you know. Something like log in and make one successful API call, or if you are dealing with a payment API, create a credit card payment, you know. If you provide a clear goal, you have a useful report at the end of this process, you know. And when you run the agent, it's really important to ask it to explain what it's doing on each step, you know. So this way you can understand what it is understanding from the docs, what is confusing, and what were the problems that it found. And you can rerun it multiple times, because the LLMs, they are not always going to follow the same path, you know. So for the same goal, you can run it 2-3 times to see if the path that the agent is following is always the same, or if it found something different, you know. And at the end, you have all the logs from this test, you know. You will see where it broke, what was missing, and the points that you can work to fix in the future on your documentation, you know. And this kind of information is really important, because it makes it much more easier for you to get information from your team or from the developers, because this way you can ask them, okay, why the agent was doing this task, this action, based on the API reference, compared to something like we need to improve the API reference, but without any context. So by using agents to test your docs, you have really good insights, right? So what this means for you today, what this means for your career, here I have a comparison for us to evaluate, and it's important to consider the developer reality nowadays. So developers, they write less code from scratch now compared to before. They spend more time reviewing and guiding the AI on what they expect it to produce. And the same shift is happening with the documentation. So AI is taking over the creation of the first drafts, checking the consistency, and sometimes flagging old content that doesn't work anymore. For example, using the test that I just reported. However, that's not a competition with the technical writers. That is a sign that you should focus somewhere else. So you should adapt, basically. And nowadays, what brings more value to the companies is understand the product deeply enough to document it really well. Something that the AI still can do on its own nowadays. So planning nowadays is more important than creating content, and catching the problem before anyone has to point it out to you, it's really important. So that is what you can bring to the company, this kind of value, and this will ensure that you will be noticed and on the company that you are working on right now. And as a result, I have this path, that I believe that it is something that we are following in right choice. So sure, everyone started working as a technical writer, but we need to adapt and we need to evolve. And this is the path that we are trying to achieve. We started as technical writers creating content, but nowadays we are trying to be the doc owner. We someday maybe achieving the stage of the documentation strategy guy. And to achieve this, we need to have more interaction, we need to have more information, and each step will add something else to the scope of our job. And as you evolve, you will probably writing less and less. So that at the same time, that doesn't mean that writing will disappear. It means that we need to automate part of it. Instead of focusing only on writing, we need to focus on the ownership side. You know, that is the part that doesn't get automated, and it is what makes your harder to replace in the market. If you are the owner of the whole process, no one will replace you, because the companies are made of people, and you need to have the communication and interaction ability that no LLM can provide. That is how you keep your job and even grow inside of the company. We grow contracts in right choice by doing this, by being the owner, by taking the whole process for us. And I don't want this to sound like something that I say just because it's convenient for me or for right choice. I want to share someone else's perspective. From a conversation with Manny Silva, he shared this. He was saying that companies are going to need doc owners. The job of a technical writer is changing. It is already changing, but someone still has to own the outcome. That part isn't going away, and that is coming from someone that every technical writer knows, I think. And probably you are following him on LinkedIn, for example. He's writing a lot of books about this. But today he's working in a company that aims to automate part of the process of maintaining the docs. But they still have this vision that someone needs to be the owner of this process, you know. So to finish, I don't want to leave like a summary. I would like to share something that you can apply today in your job, you know. So you can pick one project you are working on right now, something real, and starting ask yourself, is someone keeping it up to date? As the product changes, does someone knows what is coming on the roadmap before it ships? Could an agent finish an integration with my product using only what is in the docs today? So if the answer is no for one of these questions, that is fine. You didn't fail as a technical writer, you know. You just found a gap that you need to address. And that gap is exactly where the doc owner where the doc owner role starts, you know. That is my vision for the technical writing field nowadays, you know. So thank you very much for the time that you spend with me today.
Thank you, Heitor. And that's a wrap for today's session. Once again, a huge thank you to you for walking us through the topic. And of course, if you have more questions or want to learn more about Document 360, then feel free to reach out. We'll be back soon with another session. Until then, see you next time. Thank you, Heitor, and thank you, everyone.